Welcome to Occult Archives, the show where we uncover the mysteries and myths and legends behind history's, you could say most feared books.
Yeah.
If you're new here, forget those dusty history lessons. We're going right to the source, into those texts, the ones full of mystery and legend, from those strange old grimoires to ancient religious scrolls.
Right.
The secrets some thought were just too dangerous, too powerful to be known.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what kind of chaos that knowledge could unleash, right?
Exactly. So today we're doing a deep dive into a really, really revolutionary work. Have you heard of Gerald Massey?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's his revolutionary lectures, Unveiling the Mythological Roots of Christianity.
Now, that is a book that shakes things up. It really challenges what we think we know about the origins of Christianity.
It really does. And, what we have here are excerpts from Massey's lectures themselves. They're going to be our main guide. So we're going to pull out those key arguments. We're going to try to understand his main point. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better grasp of how Massey saw Christianity's beginnings. So be prepared for some surprises. And we're going on a journey into the ancient world. It's going to be like nothing you've ever heard before. Okay, let's get right into it.
Right.
Massey really goes after this idea of a historical Jesus right from the start.
Yeah, that's where he kicks things off. He brings in this Jewish tradition. It seems like an actual historical account. It talks about Jehoshua Ben-Pandira.
Okay.
And this guy was, according to the tradition, a student of Jehoshua Ben-Pandira. And Ben-Pandira was a really big deal, president of the Sanhedrin in the 2nd century BCE. Now, what's important here right off the bat is the timing.
Yeah, the timing's huge here. So Massey's saying that this Ben-Pandira guy, according to this tradition, was born way earlier than when we think Jesus was born. Like way earlier, during a time of Alexander Jannaeus, who was king from 103 to 76 BCE. So if you're keeping track at home, that puts Ben-Pandira more than a century before the Jesus we read about in the Gospels. So right away, Massey's using this alternative history to question that whole timeline of Jesus's life, isn't he?
Absolutely. It's like he's suggesting, hey, maybe there was this earlier figure, or maybe there wasn't really a historical Jesus in the time the Gospels talk about.
Right.
It challenges the whole foundation of how we understand the story.
Yeah, and Massey keeps digging right. He brings up evidence that this Ben-Pandira, the teacher, had to run away to Egypt. It was around 105 BCE, persecution of the rabbis and all that.
Right.
And Massey speculates, well, if Ben-Pandira was about, let's say, 15 at that time, that would put his birth year around 120 BCE. So now we're talking about a totally different historical context. It's like rewinding the clock.
Yeah, exactly. And this isn't just some random detail he pulled out of thin air either.
Yeah.
Massey points out that by the 4th century CE, Christians were tracing the family line of Jesus back to this Pandira guy, the father of Jehoshua Ben-Pandira.
Oh, wow.
And this Jehoshua even talks up in some Egyptian sources as a magician. Apparently, he was crucified by the Jews during the reign of Queen Alexandra. She died around 69 BCE. So it's a very different narrative that Massey's weaving here.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The Jews of that time, they weren't connecting this Jehoshua Ben-Pandira with the Jesus from the Gospels.
Right.
They were supposed to be living at the same time. They didn't even know about this gospel Jesus.
Right, and that's Massey's point. He thinks it was the Christians later on who blended these two figures together. And you understand, this isn't just about two similar stories happening to bump into each other.
Right.
Massey's saying that the very core beliefs of Christianity, the practices, were taken and reworked from these older Egyptian traditions. That's a bold claim.
It is. And if you go with Massey, right, if you say the only real account we have is the Jewish one, then either the Jesus of the Gospels is actually this Jehoshua guy, or maybe there wasn't a historical Jesus at all. And that changes everything. I mean, it pushes that potential human history way back and challenges the whole historical basis of the Gospels. It's a huge claim.
Yeah. It's a huge claim. And he doesn't stop there. Massey throws in another wrench. He reminds us that the historical Herod, the one who supposedly wanted to kill baby Jesus, he died 4 years before the traditional birth date of Jesus. That's a chronological mess, right? It makes no sense.
Yeah, that doesn't add up at all. Okay, so Massey pretty much dismantles the traditional historical Jesus, and then he offers a different origin story, right? What he calls the mythical Christ.
Exactly. He thinks this mythical Christ is a much stronger explanation. And what's at the heart of that?
Well, the virgin birth.
The virgin birth, yeah. He says it's just not natural, not in the way we understand nature, and that we can only understand it through mythos and through what he calls primitive sociology.
Makes sense.
So where does he go for this? Egypt, of course. He points to Queen Mut-Imua, the mother of Amenhotep III, who was pharaoh around the 16th century BCE. Massey's really interested in Amenhotep III's reign because there was a lot of religious activity then that he thinks connects to Christianity. Anyway, Mut-Imua was often depicted as this eternal virgin giving birth to the eternal child.
And Massey describes these amazing carvings in Egyptian temples. They seem to show the announcement, the incarnation, the birth, and people worshiping this child. And who is this child? It's the Aten sun in Egypt, which is also known as God Adon in Syria, and Adonai for the Hebrews. Just so everyone's clear, the Aten sun was this major god in ancient Egypt for a while. It represented the solar disk and was part of a movement toward, well, something like monotheism. Massey sees it as a kind of forerunner to later religions. Now, this child, who was like a Christ figure in the Aten cult, was born miraculously to this ever-virgin mother, represented by Mut-Imua. It's an incredible parallel. It suggests that these ideas were around long before the traditional timeline of Jesus.
He does. And Massey really wants us to see that the virgin birth, while impossible in the human world, is completely natural and understandable within mythos.
Okay.
It comes from the symbolic language of those times. And he goes further. He says that the more hidden and mystical Christian teachings are, the easier it is to show their origins in myths.
So the deeper you go into the mysteries of Christianity, the more you find these ancient roots. It fits with his whole argument, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so he's looked at the historical timeline and the virgin birth. He also talks about astronomical and symbolic connections, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. Massey says the birth of Christ is deeply tied to astronomy, specifically to the full moon at Easter and the Metonic cycle. This is important because the Metonic cycle is a pattern of the moon's phases that repeats about every 19 years. And Massey believes that the early Christians aligned their celebrations with this cycle. He even goes as far as saying that Jesus' birthday, or maybe his resurrection, is connected to this cycle because his parents are the sun and moon.
Yeah.
That's pretty out there.
That's a big statement. He brings in the work of Cassini, the French astronomer. Cassini supposedly showed that the date assigned to Christ's birth actually lines up with a specific astronomical event, the conjunction of the sun and moon at the time of the vernal equinox in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So for Massey, this isn't just a random date. It's chosen because of its astronomical significance. It's a deliberate connection to the cosmos.
Right. And it gets even more interesting. Early church fathers, they actually assigned 2 birthdays to Jesus, the winter solstice and the vernal equinox. 2 birthdays, like that doesn't really make sense historically. Massey says these are based on the 2 birthdays of Horus in Egyptian mythology. Plutarch, the historian, he mentions Isis giving birth to baby Horus around the winter solstice. And then there's the festival of the adult Horus, which happens after the vernal equinox. So you have these big astronomical events becoming the foundation for Christian celebrations, at least according to Massey.
And it's not just birthdays, is it? He even takes gospel stories and interprets them through this lens of astronomy and symbolism, like Jesus walking on water. He doesn't see that as a literal miracle, but as a symbolic representation of a solar deity, like Oannes in Egyptian myth.
Right, the fish god who emerges from the sea.
Yeah. So Jesus walking on water becomes this solar deity rising from the water at dawn. It's like he's decoding these familiar stories and seeing them as allegories for cosmic events.
Exactly. It's a whole new way of looking at them. And this connection to Egyptian mythology, it goes beyond astronomy. Massey finds parallels in rituals and sayings, too.
For example, he compares the Christian well of living water, becoming the pool of peace, with purification rituals in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. There they have the gods of the pure waters. It's like he's finding these echoes of Egyptian belief woven into Christian practices and symbols.
Right, like a hidden language. And he goes even further. He says the whole gospel story, from the Holy Ghost coming to Mary to the Ascension, it's a reflection of pre-Christian mysteries. It's full of ideas and characters that already existed.
So for Massey, it's like Christianity is borrowing from these older traditions.
Yeah. And he's not just speculating. He gives a whole list of things connected to Christ. The virgin birth, the Magi, the transfiguration, all the miracles.
Oh.
He claims they all existed before and were applied to figures like the Egyptian Iu and the Chaldean Now.
So it's not just coincidence. He's really building a strong case here. It reminds me of that image he uses of early Christians in Egypt plastering over those ancient hieroglyphics. They couldn't erase them completely. It's like that he sees Christianity as this layer on top of an older temple of the ancient religion. Those Egyptian elements are still there beneath the surface.
It's a powerful image, right? He really gets his point across.
It does. So what does he conclude from all this? It sounds like he doesn't believe in a historical Christ at all.
Well, yeah. He basically calls Christ a popular lay figure that never really existed, a figure from pagan origins, evolving from the ram to the fish, embodying all these different gods but in human form. He even points out that for the first 7th century CE, there are no images of a crucified Christ in the Roman catacombs. Instead, you have symbols and allegories that existed even before Christianity. For him, it's more evidence that Christianity took this existing figure and made it real, turned it into the incarnated God.
Wow, that's a bold claim.
It is. And when you think about the Christian doctrine of resurrection, Massey says that even that points back to astronomy in these ancient cycles. He says resurrection is often linked to the end of a cosmic cycle, the end of the world, as it's often called. And that echoes those old beliefs about renewal and rebirth that are tied to the stars. He argues that Christian revelation doesn't actually promise individual immortality outside of this cyclical renewal. It's all about waiting for the coming one, which suggests a more circular view of salvation, not a linear one. And that's something we find in older cosmologies, right?
Yeah. Now, Massey also talks about Paul, right?
Yeah.
But not in the way we usually think of him.
No, not at all. He portrays Paul as a Gnostic.
A Gnostic.
Yeah, and an opponent of Peter, no less. That's a very different Paul than we see in traditional accounts. And it's important to remember, for Gnostics, Christ wasn't a physical being. He was pure spirit. That clashed with the whole historical Jesus narrative that was developing.
Okay, so Massey sees this tension right at the heart of early Christianity.
Absolutely. He says that Gnostics believed that the Christ of Gnosis, the spiritual Christ, couldn't actually become flesh in the way the orthodox view presented it. So they were naturally opposed to the idea of a historical Jesus. And Paul, for Massey, is a key figure in this Gnostic movement, pushing for a spiritual understanding of Christ.
So in Massey's view, what was Paul's gospel?
Gnosis itself.
Gnosis.
That whole body of spiritual knowledge.
Yeah.
And he contrasts it with what he calls the other gospel and the other Jesus that Peter was promoting. You see, Peter wanted to make the mysteries public, bring them into history. And Massey sees hints of this conflict in Paul's own letters, where he talks about having his own special gospel and warns people against other teachings.
I see.
Massey even goes as far as saying that the idea of the blood of Charis, which is this Gnostic concept of divine grace, came before the idea of the blood of Christ. And that even the Eucharist, the Christian ritual, started as a celebration of Charis before it got connected to Christ.
So for Massey, these Christian ideas have deeper roots in Gnosticism.
Exactly. And in some Gnostic writings, Paul's Christ is even identified with the angel Metatron. That takes him even further away from a human figure and makes him more like a divine intermediary. There are even references in early texts, like the Gospel of the Egyptians, to destroying the works of the woman. Massey interprets that as this tension between the Gnostic view and the more literal interpretations of Christ.
Okay, so it's like this battle for the soul of Christianity, in a way.
In a way, yeah. And here's a really provocative claim. Massey says that the earliest Gospels, the ones we think are closest to the events, are actually the furthest from any kind of human history.
Really?
Yeah. He believes the humanized Jesus came later through what he calls a conversion and perversion of Gnostic thought. He thinks early Christianity was based on secret teachings, the kind only revealed to initiates in those mystery schools. And that suggests those core teachings had nothing to do with a simple human founder, like we're told later on.
Okay, so it's all about these secret mysteries.
Yeah. He argues that these mysteries, even with a new Christian label, were basically the same as the old pagan mysteries. And he even points out that some early church figures thought certain apocryphal texts should only be read by the most advanced Christians. It's like there's this hidden layer of knowledge right at the foundation of the faith.
It's a whole different way of looking at it.
It is.
Okay, so we've got the Gnostic connection. Does Massey find these echoes in other traditions too?
Oh, absolutely. He finds sayings attributed to Christ in the teachings of the Essenes and the Talmud and the words of Buddha and even Krishna. The saying, "It is more blessed to give than to receive." He says that's Essenic in origin.
Wow. So he's drawing these connections all over the ancient world.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He emphasizes that these logia, the sayings of Jesus, they're really like the mythoi of earlier mythologies. Those bits of wisdom passed down orally way before any written records. And here's something interesting. Massey even suggests that the first form of the sayer, or the logos, was female.
Female?
Yeah, representing wisdom in its earliest form.
That's fascinating. So where does he find the roots of these sayings?
Well, he points to Egypt again, of course. He identifies figures like Io-Imhept. He actually calls him an Egyptian Jesus. And Horus, too. He sees them as the originators of these logia. and they appear in the Egyptian ritual, what we know as the Book of the Dead. He even finds similarities between the Last Judgment scene in Matthew and parts of that Egyptian ritual.
So he's seeing these deep connections between the Gospels and the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
Absolutely. He even talks about how the idea of counting the hairs on your head has significance. It's found in the Egyptian weighing of hairs during judgment, too.
Wow, so he's digging into these really specific details.
He is, and he doesn't stop there. He moves on to tracing the roots of specific events from the Gospels.
Like what?
Well, he links the temptation of Jesus on the Mount to the Egyptian myth of Horus and Set. They fight and divide the world between them.
Okay.
And the Transfiguration, Massey says, it comes from the story of Osiris, or maybe Horus, ascending the Mount of the Moon and transforming. Even the secret Sermon on the Mount, he connects that to Hermetic texts. In those texts, Hermes teaches Tat about spiritual rebirth after climbing a mountain. And the instruction to keep silent after the Transfiguration, Massey sees that as reflecting the secrecy of the ancient mystery religions.
So he's dissecting the Gospels and finding these older myths beneath the surface.
Precisely. And all of this leads him to a pretty strong critique of what he calls orthodox Christianity, the traditional view. He disagrees with the idea of a golden age of early Christianity. He says the purest Christianity was actually prehistoric, before the Roman Church.
So he's going back even further.
Way back. He even suggests that the common myths of that time actually shaped the number and type of miracles Jesus performed.
Okay, so the miracles weren't unique historical events, but part of a larger narrative.
Yeah, something like that. And remember how he talked about the Essenes? Well, he still believes Jesus or Jehoshua Ben-Pandira was connected to them. He points to shared sayings and practices found in Gnostic and Egyptian texts as proof.
Nice.
And those early Christian communities, the ones that shared everything.
Yeah.
He says that's also rooted in prehistoric Christian and Essene communities. It predates the model we see in the official church.
So he's saying it's all about going back to those earlier sources. And doesn't he also question the whole idea of Christianity being a unique revelation?
Oh, absolutely. He's very critical of the reliance on the Hebrew Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. He even blames it for holding back scientific progress. He disagrees with the idea that Hebrew and Greek thought didn't come from Egypt. He points to things like the creation of woman from man, which is found in Egyptian magical texts.
Okay.
And the 4 corners or elements in mythology, he says those come from Egyptian symbolism too. Even the 6 days of creation in Genesis, he thinks that might be a shortened version of something older, maybe related to those 6 periods of festivals in the Persian Bundahish.
So he's finding these echoes everywhere.
He is, and his comparisons go even further. He sees parallels between Egyptian and Babylonian gods and concepts. Things like the Ogdo, the 8 deities,
Okay.
the number 7, which is super important to many traditions, and the mother goddesses who pop up all over the place. He's basically saying there's this common thread running through all these ancient cultures.
That's fascinating. Now, what about the devil? Does Massey believe in the devil?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. He doesn't see the devil as some real supernatural being. For him, the devil is more like this misbegotten devil of ignorance, a symbol of humanity's mistakes in the past. He connects the horned new moon to the idea of self-renewal in mythology. And the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, he traces that back to the monthly cycle of the sun, moon, and the male reproductive principle in nature.
No, it's all symbolic.
Very symbolic. And he even says that the mythical devil was fading away until Christian theologians brought him back.
So they revived the devil.
In a way, yeah. He thinks the medieval devil was actually a weaker figure compared to those earlier, more primal conceptions. And he makes this striking statement about the devil's role in Christianity. No devil, no redeemer. Basically, he's saying that the whole idea of the devil, the fall of man, and the need for atonement are at the very core of orthodox Christianity. It all hangs together.
Okay, I see. And this ties into his view of good and evil, right?
It does. Massey doesn't think of evil as some outside force. For him, it comes from what he calls unhumanized conditions, the things that hold humanity back. And our job, he says, is to work on those conditions, to turn evil into good. Even pain, he sees it as a necessary signal, a warning that we need to change and grow.
It's a more evolutionary perspective, isn't it?
It is, and it leads him to criticize some core Christian doctrines, like the idea of vicarious sacrifice. He even suggests a link between that idea and practices like vivisection.
Okay, that's a pretty strong statement.
It is. He also can't stand the idea of eternal punishment. He calls it appalling, especially coming from a supposedly loving God. He thinks it just leads to eternal wretchedness and says that Christianity relies too much on fear. Instead, he says, we should focus on living ethically in this world, not just preparing for the next one.
So he's calling for a more practical, earth-centered approach.
Exactly. And remember how he talked about the Gnostic God-man?
Yeah.
He wants to be clear that this doesn't mean some human was turned into a god. It's about the divine nature that's inside all of us.
So everyone has that potential.
Everyone. And he rejects the idea that the historical Christ was the only one who realized that potential.
Okay, I see.
And all of this leads him to say that Christianity is built on falsehood and misunderstanding. He thinks the story of the fall of man is just an ancient fable that's been misinterpreted. He even questions whether Christianity really helped civilization progress. He says we owe more to the natural progress of different races, and that calling all good things Christian is just rewriting history to fit a narrative.
That's a pretty radical critique.
It is. And in contrast to blindly following these old teachings, Massey emphasizes the importance of direct experience and spiritualism. He believes in things like inner vision, premonitions, and even ghosts. He sees them as natural parts of human experience, distinct from the idea of physical resurrection.
So he's opening up the door to these other ways of knowing.
Yeah, and he sees spiritualism as this bridge between the living and the dead. He thinks it focuses on making this life better and helping others.
It's a more active approach.
Very active. He even believes that true spiritualism, the kind based on experience, can break down those false religious dogmas.
So it's about challenging those established beliefs. And ultimately, Massey champions free thinking and the pursuit of knowledge over blind faith. He criticizes those who take ancient myths as literal truth.
Right, and he even talks about how he was criticized by those traditional Egyptologists. They didn't like his ideas one bit.
Yeah, it's always tough to challenge the status quo.
It is. And Massey wants us to understand where religious ideas come from. He traces them back to those ancient mysteries, those altered states of consciousness that formed the basis for Gnostic religions. He talks about trance, transformation, and communication with spirits in all sorts of cultures. And he contrasts that direct knowledge with the modern demand for blind faith. It's like he's saying we've lost something along the way. He even compares spiritualism to a glowworm, shining in the darkness.
Okay.
It's a little light of ancient wisdom that's being ignored in the supposed daylight of modern skepticism.
So we've lost touch with those older ways of knowing.
In a way, yeah.
Now, he also connects modern spiritual practices to shamanism, right?
He does. He draws parallels to the Maori traditions, African priests who use trance, and those who seek guidance from spirits. He even talks about the serpent as a symbol of wisdom and a way to enter trance for divination. And did you know that some ancient cultures used intoxication as a way to talk to spirits, like the Hindus under the Tree of Knowledge?
Wow, that's interesting. So he's looking at all these different methods of accessing that spiritual realm. And doesn't he talk about the Egyptian mummy as a symbol of transformation?
Oh, yeah. He calls the mummy the Christ, or Christ. He sees it as the ultimate symbol of transformation and rebirth in Egyptian belief. And all those objects buried with the dead, they represent durability and renewal. He also talks about the phallic logos.
Okay.
He connects the first male image of Christ to puberty, the change from boy to man. It's like a primal physical version that Paul later replaced with a more spiritual Christ.
And he talks about the 7 souls, right?
The 7 souls, yeah. And how they become one in the 8th.
Mm.
He finds parallels in Hinduism and Gnosticism. Think of the 7-armed Agni or the 8-rayed star of the Gnostic Christ. That 8th one is like the final unified form.
I see. So it's about bringing those different aspects together.
Exactly. And in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the deceased goes on this journey, playing the roles of 7 characters to reach that 8th permanent state. It's all about collecting and unifying those 7 souls to achieve immortality. The pleas not to lose the souls, the joining of the bones and the heart, they're all part of this mystical reconstruction.
So it's like a spiritual puzzle.
Yeah, you could say that. And he compares that direct experience of unity and spiritualism with the ancient physics behind the 7 souls. He even critiques theosophy for downplaying spiritual experiences.
Okay, so he's really advocating for that personal experiential approach.
He is. And when you think about those early ideas of souls and ghosts, he sees them as evolving. At first, they were just shades or coverings. But as our understanding grew, so did the idea of the soul. He even connects it to those old beliefs about ghosts having a limited lifespan.
It's like a progression of thought.
Yeah, exactly. And those 7 souls in Egypt, he suggests they each had a sacrifice in the Eucharistic rites. So he traces a line from those animal sacrifices all the way to the Christian Eucharist.
It's a continuity of practice.
It is. And here's a key point. Massey doesn't believe that real wisdom needs to be hidden in mystery. He thinks open explanation is the soul of science.
So no more secrets.
Right. And what's his own mission? He wants to educate those who don't know and uplift those who are struggling. He wants knowledge to be available to everyone. And he dismisses modern occultism as just a fake version of the real thing.
So he's on a quest for truth.
Yeah.
That's a powerful mission. So here we are at the end of our deep dive into Gerald Massey's revolutionary lectures. You can see how he really takes apart those traditional Christian stories. And he offers a completely different perspective rooted in Egyptian mythology, Gnosticism, and his interpretation of astronomical events.
Yeah. And his work is still controversial.
It definitely is. But it makes you think, doesn't it? It forces you to consider that maybe there's more to the story than we've been told. Maybe there's this long history of cultural exchange and the evolution of religious ideas over thousands of years. His challenge to the historical Jesus and his focus on the mythical and symbolic side of Christianity, it's a whole new way of looking at things.
It is. And I'd like to leave our listeners with a question.
Okay, go ahead.
If all these religious stories borrow and adapt from older traditions, what does that say about belief itself? Does it make it less meaningful? Or maybe more meaningful, in a way? I'll let you ponder that.
That's a good one to think about. Thank you for joining us on Occult Archives. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep searching for those hidden truths.
See you next time.